Today we are speaking to Francisco, member of the team of Tansy Network, a project that is focusing on app chains. Right now, there's a big trend definitely in app chains, and it's getting easier to build this, but there's still some problems for the teams that want to build this chain. So Tansy is focusing on that, and we're going to speak about it. Fran, thank you so much for the time. Can you please explain to me a summary about Tansy Network, please?
Yeah, no, for sure. And first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, my name is Francisco. I'm the CEO of Moondance Labs. Moondance Labs is essentially the development company responsible for building Tansy. And yeah, I would describe Tansy as an app chain infrastructure protocol. So it's a protocol that is meant to make it significantly easier for developers to deploy their own app chains. Because, and a little bit of context here as to like how we got involved with this project. The founding team of Tansy and Moondance Labs, we were previously core contributors to the Moonbeam network. So we spent several years building out the Moonbeam ecosystem. And throughout our time at Moonbeam, we kind of experienced firsthand how difficult it actually is to build a chain, right? Whether you call it an app chain or a layer one, I mean, we just saw that it took a lot of effort and there were a lot of friction points involved with launching a chain. And despite that kind of all those kind of friction points and infrastructure overhead required to launch a chain, there's been a significant amount of growth in the app chain space in general, right? So then we started speaking to a lot of teams, obviously in the Polkadot ecosystem, Cosmos, we spoke to some Avalanche subnets, and it became very clear to us that this problem with deploying app chains and all the effort that's required around it, it was not only specific to Moonbeam and Polkadot, but it was kind of a pervasive issue across the entire industry. So that's really when we decided to go out and build Tansy, which again is really meant to kind of make it a lot easier to deploy app chains. And I'm sure we'll dive into more details at what it actually does and what Tansy is. But the goal is really to dramatically reduce the time to market required to launch an app chain, making it a lot more convenient and a lot more effortless for developers to build their own chains.
Can you maybe deep dive into like what's an app chain? And maybe can you compare them to, you mentioned maybe you could consider a layer two also an app chain, right? So where can you make the difference between an app chain and maybe a general purpose chain?
Yeah, no, and I know that there's a lot of like terminology out there right now, right? Like I think the main difference with building an app chain, I would describe an app chain as like a developer or a development team that simply wants to build their own chain, right? Whether that is like a general purpose chain like an L1 or a chain that is meant for one use case. I mean, in the end of the day, it's in the name, right? It's an application specific chain. So you're building an entire chain for your specific, for one application, as opposed, the opposite of that would be to simply deploy smart contracts, right? In a shared EVM environment like Ethereum or Moonbeam, which has been traditionally the prevalent or more, the prevalent model for developers to build their applications is just to kind of deploy smart contracts in a shared EVM environment. And you're kind of sharing block space with everyone who's building in that EVM environment, right? As opposed to building your own chain where you have your own kind of dedicated blockchain for your specific use case. So you're not really sharing block space with any other projects in that regard. So I would say those are kind of the main two differences between smart contract deployments and deploying your own app chain.
And how complex is to build a blockchain today? And do you think maybe in a point in time, will it be as easy as building a website now to deploy a chain or an L2?
Yeah, no, and that's really the goal with what we're building with Tansy, right? The goal is to make deploying app chains as easy as deploying a smart contract. Obviously, it's a lot more challenging from a technical perspective to build your own chain as opposed to just deploying a smart contract. You know, you have to bootstrap a validator set to secure the chain, right? To provide the security for the chain. That's not always easy to do, to bootstrap a validator set. Then once you launch the chain, you need to maintain it, right? There's a lot of, in Polkadot specifically, there's like runtime upgrades. There's maintenance of the chain involved that requires resources. And then once you launch the chain, you realize that you need all of this complementary tooling that you otherwise would already have in a shared EVM environment like Moonbeam, right? So you realize, okay, now I need wallets. Now I need an indexer. I need oracles, RPC endpoints. So there's a lot of different like complementary tools that are just inherent to building a chain. And when you deploy on something like Moonbeam, for example, you have all those tools readily available once you deploy a smart contract. But when you build a chain, you're taking on the responsibility of putting all of those components in place. So when you start adding all of those different variables together, the end result is like months of work, basically, and a lot of kind of effort and finding out how these things work. And that's where we really want to, that the value we want to add with Tansy is cutting that time to market from months to just a few hours, right? By kind of providing all of those components out of the box, you know, like an execution environment, block production as a service, managing the state transitions, security, wallets, indexers, oracles. That's really the idea with Tansy, is kind of providing all of these components in a permissionless protocol so that it becomes significantly easier for developers to launch their own chains.
And what about you? Also, right now you focus a lot on the time, the complexity of doing all this, but also I recently read somewhere about how expensive it is to run a chain, you know? So what about cost? Can you tell me about like what's the average cost of running like a chain at the current in the current ecosystems, like maybe Cosmos, Polkadot you mentioned, and how can Tansy bring down those costs?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think each ecosystem has their own kind of cost structure, right? We're seeing right now that, I mean, and we can talk about L2s as well. I think you mentioned it in one of the questions. This is like something that's very hot right now in terms of narratives. It's not only kind of L2s like Arbitrum and Optimism, which are more general purpose L2s, but kind of app rollups or application specific L2s, which is similar to an app chain, but instead of having kind of like your own layer 1, you have your own layer 2 for your application, right? Mm-hmm. There, I think there's fixed costs involved of like running your own sequencer. But I would say the biggest cost is the variable cost of data availability. So data availability is this concept of posting the data of blocks onto an L1 like Ethereum. That is currently like quite expensive to do on ETH mainnet, and hence why these like new chains like Celestia and Eigenlayer DA are starting to come to life, because the value proposition is to kind of reduce the cost of that data availability and what it costs to post that data on chain. So that's being worked on in Tansy. I think, yeah, we're aiming to reduce the cost significantly by, I would say, but the infrastructure overhead, right? Because all the effort required to put all of these components in place, usually you need to have a team to do all these things. So by using a protocol like Tansy, it would kind of reduce the cost and the effort required. And I think something that I'm particularly hot on with the architecture of Tansy is that the fact that it's a protocol. I think this is something worth mentioning, right? Because right now what I'm seeing is a proliferation of like rollups as a service, app chains as a service. There's a lot of different projects doing this right now. But for the most part, what I'm seeing is that they're kind of service level agreement styled structures, right? Where you're essentially like paying a development team or a development shop for them to like implement the chain on your behalf. But that is like, it requires like human work, labor, whereas if you do it from a protocol perspective where it's fully permissionless, this is something that I think hasn't fully been done today, right? I think this is like a big differentiator for what we want to do. 𝗕𝘆 is going to be fully permissionless, automated. It's going to leverage the shared security model of the relay chain of Polkadot. And then 𝗕𝘆 itself will be a parachain on Polkadot that provides kind of execution services, right? So by that, I mean that the block production nodes of 𝗕𝘆 will produce blocks on behalf of these app chains that deploy through 𝗕𝘆. So the fact that you're using shared resources, like shared resources from the relay chain of Polkadot, shared block production resources from 𝗕𝘆, this is kind of analogous to like the cloud, right? Like what the cloud did for Web 2, where there before, when you wanted to run an application, you had to basically run all the infrastructure yourself, which was time consuming, it was expensive. And then AWS came around and made things a lot more efficient for developers to run infrastructure, right? So I see this shift happening in Web3 today. And I see very clear like architectural competitive advantages that Polkadot and 𝗕𝘆 have that can enable this type of model, right? Where it's kind of a full-on like protocol that allows you to deploy app chains seamlessly. And that ties in again to the differentiations I see that we have versus rollups on Ethereum, where we're really prioritizing security, decentralization, composability through XCM, right? Native composability, modularity, and flexibility that Substrate offer. But yeah, no, I know that that's a long answer for the question, but yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about like, so you mentioned that it's on Polkadot, it will have its own parachain. So 𝗕𝘆 will service or is focused on servicing like parachains L1s in the Polkadot ecosystem, or can like Cosmos chains benefit use 𝗕𝘆 in some way, or even L2s?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. For now, I think we're leveraging our expertise with Substrate in general. I mean, the team has a lot of experience in building with Substrate from our experience at Moonbeam. So we've really been able to leverage that experience. For now, we're focusing in the Polkadot ecosystem for those reasons that I mentioned. But yeah, who knows like what the future holds. We're also thinking, I see a lot of like a big narrative around modularity right now, you know, like decoupling kind of execution, which is what layer 2s do, right? Data availability and then settlement and finality. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about that, but I honestly think that people are arguing that it's a lot more efficient, that it's more scalable, this like modular narrative. But I also think that there's a lot of hidden costs around like engineering complexity that involves like kind of decoupling all these things together. There's a lot to be said about the simplicity for developers to kind of keep everything in one system. So we are exploring like these scenarios where potentially we could use Polkadot for DA or settlement, but then use execution somewhere else. For now, I think we are focusing on in the Polkadot ecosystem. Yeah.
And how do you see right now? Well, it was announced Polkadot 2.0, and in general, it lowers the barriers to enter the ecosystem. So do you think 𝗕𝘆 will help bootstrap so teams can create parachains faster? And
yeah, no, 100%. I'm really looking forward to Polkadot 2.0 and like the agile core time or the pay-as-you-go model. I think this has been one of the most significant barriers of entry into the ecosystem, this idea that, you know, in order to secure a parachain or an app chain, you have to win like the auction. For many teams, that presents a barrier, right? Because not all teams have the liquidity necessary to like bootstrap the auction and win the auction itself. So, I mean, this concept now is introducing it's a different economic model to purchase block space, right? With the current model in Polkadot 1.0, developers that want to launch their own chain are kind of obligated to win a slot for 2 years, right? But for a lot of developers that are just starting out, it's not necessary to have to purchase like 2 years worth of block space, right? It's kind of an analogous situation with a businessman or an entrepreneur who's just starting out. He doesn't know whether he's going to be able to sell his inventory or whatever he wants to try out, and he has to buy like 2 years worth of inventory. That's not really an efficient model for someone starting out. So this new model introduces the concept of on-demand block space, right? Instead of having to reserve block space for 2 years, you can pay for blocks as you go, right? And I think this is like the concept of block space on demand is very underrated, because this solves a very like significant problem that regarding related to costs, right? That you were just talking about, Matt. So one of the problems right now with app chains is that, you know, app chains are kind of forced to produce blocks every X amount of seconds, depending on what ecosystem you're in. And this presents like a capital inefficiency scenario, right? Because a lot of teams that are just starting out, who know, like they might have to bootstrap an entire validator set for their app chain. But the blocks being produced might be empty, right? So you're having to pay like validators a percentage of your inflation. You have to pay costs on every block that's produced in terms of data availability. So there is like a big capital inefficiency happening around app chains that I think is going to be completely like optimized by this model of pay as you go, right? Because now you only have to pay for the blocks you actually need produced, instead of being forced to produce blocks in any scenario. So I think that from an economic perspective, it's going to make app chains on Tansy and Polkadot significantly more competitive than other ecosystems. And yeah, as with everything, I expect that perhaps there will be like technical complexity for developers to tap into that technology. So I see Tansy being very complementary to that approach, where Tansy has always been to abstract the infrastructural complexity tied to like interacting with that technology and that infrastructure, right? So we want to make it extremely simple for developers to utilize that technology. So I see Tansy as being very strategic and complementary to that. And to be honest, Tansy was originally conceived with the idea of pay-as-you-go chains in mind. We just, it's not entirely certain when it's going to ship. So we decided to start with parachains in the meantime.
All right. And what kind of chains can people build? Like, there's like, I would say EVM and WebAssembly is like are the main, at least in the Polkadot ecosystem. Like, what types of chain can Tansy help build? What exactly can you specify? Like, can developers pick and choose exactly what services Tansy is gonna provide, or it's like a full package where you choose like what type of chain you want and it comes like as it is, like a set?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say that, you know, there's a couple of responsibilities that fall on the developer when they're building their own chain, right? The lower level kind of protocol responsibilities are, of course, like what we already discussed, right? Data availability, finality, settlement, and like execution. So those lower level, like at a protocol level, they're going to be handled by the relay chain of Polkadot, which provides the finality and the security. And then Tansy provides the execution environment, in other words, producing blocks, right? And managing the state transitions. So that already is kind of removed from the developer by kind of automating it via kind of the Tansy chain and the relay chain of Polkadot. Then there's the integrations, right? So, okay, now you launch the chain, you have your validator set, everything is working. Then you need, okay, like I can't work like without a wallet or indexers, oracles, RPC endpoints, all these different kind of tools that are just necessary for the chain. That is going to be included in the developer experience with Tansy. We're not building those things ourselves. We're working with a lot of kind of providers within the ecosystem. The idea being to kind of include those tools in the UI or the dApp of Tansy, so developers can pick and choose like, okay, I need a wallet, I need this indexer, I need this block explorer. The idea being that when you launch the chain, those things are already included in the deployment. So you don't have to go out and individually speak to all of these teams, again, wasting time. So then the only responsibility that would fall on the team is what you call kind of the substrate runtime, or the runtime of the chain, which is essentially kind of the logic, right? It's kind of the application layer of the chain itself. And in that regard, you know, developers will have the option to upload like their own custom logic or their own custom runtime into the Tansy dApp, and everything should kind of run under the hood so that they don't have to manage the infrastructure side of things. But we're also providing, the team has been building like kind of these pre-compiled or pre-packaged templates. So essentially we build the runtime upfront on behalf of the developer, and we package that into a template so that they can launch the logic of the chain in one click. Right now, we have like an EVM template, and we have a lot of experience with EVM from our days in Moonbeam. And I think one differentiator with EVMs in our ecosystem in particular is that we've developed a lot of pre-compiled contracts, which allow for Solidity smart contracts to tap into substrate native functionality like governance, staking. I mean, there's like 20 pre-compiles that we're going to be including in that template over time. There's a substrate template, but like you said, Matt, I mean, you can use a WASM smart contract template. And over time, these templates are going to grow, right? It can be vertical specific templates like a DeFi template or an NFT template. And within these templates, this is the power of Substrate, right? That Substrate what has these so-called palettes that are very modular and that they kind of take care of specific functions of the logic of the chain so that you can kind of customize things to a very granular level. So far, naturally, we've seen, I mean, we launched like a builders program recently, an AppChain Pioneers. We're calling it AppChain Pioneers program. We have like up to 40 teams that join that program. The vast majority are launching EVM because I think that's just what has the most traction. But yeah, over time, we're going to see more and more of these templates. And for us, it's really just about giving the developer options, right? They can either pick these templates or they can use their own custom logic, always having like this infrastructure kind of component abstracted away by the Tansy protocol.
That's amazing. And I love to see like this trend of abstraction, and it gets like more accessible for regular people or like less professional people to start playing around at least, or less like with less team and less effort. So that's great to see. What's the status of the project right now? Like, how does the roadmap look? What can you tell me about this?
Yeah, no, for sure. So yeah, I'm happy to say that we just launched our testnet. So the team has been working like long late nights to deploy the testnet. I think this is like one of the most significant milestones for the project, right? Having an actual tangible product that developers can use and interact with. And this is really like the V1, right? So we're gonna take feedback from developers who are using the product from our Pioneers program and other teams that want to try it out and iterate and improve the product. So with the launch of the testnet, we also launched our documentation site, which for us is very important to have kind of high quality docs, and the Tansy dApp, right? The Tansy dApp is essentially a UI that allows you to utilize the protocol in the backend. So we launched that as well. So those are kind of the main kind of highlights that we work towards. And now it's really to kind of add on to the protocol in terms of functionalities. And the aim is to really deploy on mainnet, I would say Q1 of next year. Yeah.
How does the dApp look? How does the interaction look? What can you do in this dApp?
Yeah, the dApp is essentially like a way to launch the app chain without having to use a command line, right? So it makes things a lot more simple to use Tansy. So it's kind of launching a parachain basically, from like reserving the parachain ID to generating the data that you need to launch the chain, and that includes like RPC endpoints, the block production nodes that run the chain, and we're going to keep adding to this dApp, right? The idea is that the dApp will be kind of your control center to not only launch the app chain, but then step 2 is making it kind of like a management center where you can see control different aspects, manage kind of the RPC endpoints, the tooling like wallets, block explorers, runtime upgrade tooling. So we want to make kind of this a comprehensive tool to make it just a lot easier to manage your app chain in one place.
And can you tell me, I'm curious about the Pioneers program, like you mentioned already, like they're building mostly EVM chains, but what kinds of apps are they focusing on, like DeFi gaming, real world?
Yeah, for sure. Honestly, we're seeing use cases across the board. So there's a lot of DeFi teams, there's lending protocols, there's marginal trading protocols, there's NFT projects. Gaming is a big topic as well, right? I think for gaming, particularly games that require a lot of the components to be on chain, I think this is a great use case for app chains, right? Because we've seen that if a game is like fully on chain, that's very tolling on block space. And yeah, if there's like an NFT mint happening or gas prices spike, it becomes like prohibitively expensive for users to use the game, right? So having your own app chain gives you kind of the sovereignty and dedicated block space that guarantees a better user experience. There's a decentralized identity solution that's building their own app chain. So yeah, we really are seeing like a bunch of different use cases across the board, which is exciting.
Nice. And I wanted to ask you your opinion about, we already touched on it, but how do you see this trend and maybe possible competition between L2s and these like L1 ecosystems like Polkadot or Cosmos? Maybe can you tell us what can you see as benefits or like bad things from L2s or app chains? Like maybe some are better for each type of project. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. And I think about this topic quite a lot. Honestly, I'm a little bit against like projects that say, you know, oh yeah, my protocol or my project is the best at everything, because you already know that that's like not true, right? I think it really is about trade-offs in my mind. So, and I know that roll-ups and roll-apps, like app-specific roll-ups right now are kind of the most popular thing. You know, in my mind, I would say that centralization is in my mind, it's a very big trade-off with roll-ups, right? I think people right now are in the bear market, activity has kind of converged back to Ethereum, and this is why we're seeing this like rise of roll-ups. But for me, it's like, yeah, there's like one sequencer, there's one node essentially that's responsible for relaying transactions from the L2 to settle on Ethereum mainnet. So this raises a lot of concerns, right? It's quite centralized to just have one node or one entity responsible for relaying all transactions of that network. So I think in that regard, we take the principle of decentralization quite seriously. The Polkadot network has hundreds of validators, and we'll aim to have like a lot of collators on Tansy as well. It's kind of the Tansy collator can be thought of as like, and I know this is being worked on in Ethereum as well, the shared sequencing, right? So you have like a decentralized set of sequencers relaying the transactions instead of just having one. I'm not sure when that's going to be shipped, so it's being talked about a lot, but who knows, like if it'll be years or how long it'll take. So definitely centralization is one point that I see a clear differentiation. I would say modularity as well, or flexibility, right? We've seen that like the EVM, most of these roll-ups or roll-ups as a service are EVM based, so they're not nearly as customizable as Substrate is. And the EVM is great. I mean, there's a lot of adoption using EVM, but it's not the best for some use cases, right? Like the EVM is simply inefficient for some use cases, or it becomes too expensive. Like storage, for example, like storage doesn't really work for EVM. So there's just some types of use cases that are better suited for other tech stacks like Wasm or Substrate. You saw that the guy from Maker recently kind of,
I was gonna say that actually.
Yeah, he likes the Solana tech stack because I think it's a lot more efficient for kind of some of the back-end tasks that he wants to do for Maker, whereas the EVM wouldn't be as efficient. So that's definitely another thing. I would say interoperability or composability. This is a problem with rollups, I think. I mean, these are all things that are being actively worked on, but I mean, it's taken Polkadot like 7 or 8 years to ship these features. So it's not something that you build overnight, right? So having XCM is a huge advantage. Having kind of trust minimized ways of interoperating with or interacting, communicating with other chains. This is something that Polkadot is very strong in. And it's a challenge for a lot of app chains in general, right? Like this is one of the benefits of deploying smart contracts, is that when you deploy on something like Moonbeam or Ethereum, you share native composability with everyone else who's deployed in that EVM. When you deploy an app chain, you're kind of an island, so to speak. So then, okay, what do? Do I build my own bridge? We spoke to some Cosmos projects. I think this is maybe a trade-off of Cosmos, that it's more fragmented in that regard. We spoke to some Cosmos projects that they were like, you know, getting a direct integration with the more prominent bridges like Axelar, Layer 0, Wormhole, it's not that easy, right? Like you need to have certain metrics for them to come and integrate your chain. So some teams are forced to build their own bridge, which takes a tremendous amount of work and time. And I think this is another kind of competitive advantage I see with Tansy chains, is that once chains launch, they're going to have like a direct connection via XCM back to Moonbeam. And Moonbeam has like, they just launched this concept called Moonbeam routed liquidity, which essentially takes liquidity from Wormhole or any other bridge like Axelar or Layer 0, I know that's being worked on, and kind of distribute that to all parachains within the Polkadot ecosystem. And this can be applied to not only liquidity and token transfers, but to message passing as well, right? So a Tansy app chain gets a connection to Moonbeam through XCM, and by association, they would be connected through Moonbeam to like Axelar, Layer 0, Wormhole, Hyperlane. So they would have a direct connection to the more prominent bridges to interact with like Ethereum or Avalanche or Arbitrum or all these different networks out of the box, right? And that's an extremely powerful thing. And we're even starting to see hybrid scenarios, right? Which I think is super exciting, where it's not just because you have an app chain doesn't mean that that's mutually exclusive with having smart contract deployments. So we're seeing use cases where developers might need an app chain to kind of offload certain workloads of the application. For example, the gaming logic, right? If the gaming logic is entirely on chain, it's useful to have that in your own app chain since you have dedicated block space. But then you can still connect that to like a shared EVM environment like Ethereum or Arbitrum through something like Axelar, Layer 0, Wormhole, so that you kind of access users and liquidity where they are, but you still can kind of offload certain logic to an app chain. And I think this is super exciting, right? That we're seeing kind of these hybrid models, and we're already starting to see it happen. So so that's another aspect I see that differentiates. I think those would probably be the main ones. Yeah.
Nice.
And this concept of shared security as well. I know that a lot of people they're working a lot on this, but again, it goes back to, it's very difficult to build these things after like years after you've kind of set a foundation. Polkadot was kind of built with all these aspects in mind from day one. So it's kind of built specifically for to specialize for these use cases, which is extremely difficult to replicate, right? So again, it's really about like trade-offs.
And well, that's amazing. Actually, I really enjoy what you have said, all this conversation. I wanted to ask you about one last question. How do you see the future maybe, and can Tansy help build this future of enterprise chains or permission chains for like companies, universities, where like it's more about a closed system where you have to be verified maybe to interact, which could, I think, could be possible to use as like training wheels for people before going out for like permissionless chains where people can get robbed and hacked and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's definitely an option. I mean, I think large companies, enterprise, it probably makes sense for them to have like their own environment, right? Because they have control. This is one of the reasons why I see so much demand in app chains, is because you have control and sovereignty about everything you do, right? Governance as well is another great example of why people want their own chain. But regarding enterprise, yeah, it's definitely possible to have like a permission set of collators or block production nodes that they control. The deployment process is a little bit different once it becomes permissioned. And I think this is what most companies are doing out there, because I would say it's a lot more difficult to build a permissionless protocol that automates app chain deployments as opposed to just offering this service level agreement style approach that we spoke about before. That's definitely an option with Tansy that we'll probably explore, and we're already having conversations about. So yeah, I see both use cases being able to be met by Tansy.
And please tell me, did I miss something? Do you have something interesting to tell us? Like what's beyond the testnet that you just launched, where people can now test, visit, and see like the near future of Tansy?
Yeah, for sure. I would say for anyone that wants to get involved, please reach out. You can try out the dApp. If you want to get involved with the project, join the ambassador program, which launched recently. So that allows you really to engage with the community and get more engaged with the project and the core team of Tansy. So I would encourage you to reach out. I'm always online on Telegram, and the DApp is live as well, so you can try it out. But yeah, I would just encourage people to reach out if this sounded interesting, and we're kind of pushing forward with developing the protocol. So.
Well, thanks for your time, and I hope to see Tansy help build thousands of chains in the near future. So
yeah, for sure.
good luck, and I appreciate the hard work. I can see it definitely. So that's something I have to congratulate you and the whole team.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thanks again for having me. It was a pleasure. Always great to speak with people involved in the industry, and yeah, happy to do this again anytime. And thanks everyone for listening out there. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll have a conversation in the near future in the next big update.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks a lot, man. Have a great day.